60% mental and 40% physical.
Math was never our strong suit, but breaking down Ohio State football is. Sit back and join us for Buckeye Grove Instant Access, part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network.
You can do it!
Brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. Post-game thoughts, immediate analysis, and much, much more to put the big game into perspective. Without any further delay of game, here's your host, Kevin Noon.
Kevin, goddammit.
Welcome to the BIA podcast, Buckeye Grove Instant Access. I'm your host, Kevin Noon, and I want to thank you all for listening to our great show. I'll be bringing in Jacob Benge here in a second. It is a Friday. We are still less than 2 weeks removed from Ohio State's final game of the 2020 season. But that doesn't mean that we're not ready to look ahead to 2021 with news happening today. We had the opportunity to talk to head coach Ryan Day, and he dropped all sorts of good news and interesting news on that call as well. We are at the point now where we kind of know who's coming or who's leaving in terms of the NFL draft coming up and everything else. But let me bring Jacob in and get kind of his opinion on stuff. First and foremost, welcome to the show, Jacob.
Hey, Kevin, it's good to be back on the podcast, and kind of what you alluded to. It's good to hear from Ryan Day again, for the first time since the national championship against Alabama.
Yeah, I honestly didn't think we would hear from him much before National Signing Day, which is coming up here in a couple of weeks. And I'll save all of those topics for a show coming up later with Joseph Hastings. I know that I have you wear many hats. Recruiting analyst is not one of them, but something that is in your wheelhouse. We learned today... There'd been whispers of it, but we learned today officially Greg Mattison retiring after 2 years with the Buckeyes, co-defensive coordinator, well into his 70s, certainly has had, a lot of time in the game of football, certainly creates a lot of intrigue for the offseason, an offseason that already is going to have plenty of intrigue.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, just taking a look at his bio on the Ohio State page, he's got so much experience and at so many levels. And we heard Day talking earlier about how much he's meant to the program and how much he's meant to, some of the linebackers. And, with the veteran linebacking core that Ohio State had, they really had a chance to learn so much from Mattison and what he brought from the number of programs that he had also coached at prior to Ohio State. So his departure is sure to leave a hole in that coaching staff, just because experience is hard to replace. And so I'm now curious who is going to fill Mattison's, absence.
One of the things that I thought when they hired Greg Mattison is that it was a situation of, they bring in a young guy with Jeff Hafley and they bring in an elder statesman with Greg Mattison. And I always felt that Greg Mattison was instrumental to coaching coaches as much as he was to coaching players. I mean, he comes in a co-defensive coordinator role, is kind of a rover in terms of he doesn't have a position group that he is attached to. And now, you see him moving on, but, Ohio State brought in an elder statesman and bringing in Kerry Combs. So, a lot of things are open at this point. Do they bring in somebody else who kind of splits the defensive coordinator role with Kerry? With, Greg not having a position that he was attached to, where is the background of this guy going to be? Do they bring in somebody to split up the defensive backs, maybe a safeties guy, maybe then move Matt Barnes more to a full-time special teams role instead of a assistant defensive backs coach? I mean, and we're not going to get to the point of where we're going to start throwing out names. There's plenty of time for that here down the line. But, we really don't know what the plan is for this role. But, one thing I think we all can say is this move didn't catch Ryan Day or the coaching staff by surprise. I'd been hearing whispers of it, back in December. So I don't think that this is something that came out of left field. So, maybe while Ryan Day hasn't had the opportunity to do a ton of due diligence in terms of contacting people, I think that he is probably the only person out there that has an idea of what it is he's looking for.
Yeah, it's a great point. He's probably been looking at possible candidates for some time now, a few weeks. And it's a good question whether to replace Mattison in-house or look for outside options. And so, Griffin wrote a story about, a follow-up to his retirement story, and some pretty good information was in there. And I'm taking a look just at some of the coaches on Ohio State's, roster right now. And, with Combs coming in last season, he obviously brings a lot of experience too. And I know, Cincinnati had Marcus Freeman go to Notre Dame, who was obviously a hot, commodity in that department. But, Ohio State really, Al Washington coaches the linebackers, and then there's Matt Barnes, as you mentioned. I'm curious if Day, has a whole lot of trust in those guys, because he's obviously coached with those guys for some time now. But something that was also mentioned was Day's experience in the NFL. And so that opens up a whole other can of worms in terms of who could fill Mattison's shoes, and what sort of schemes the next coach could offer in terms of the defense. That obviously was a sight to watch this season.
And I'll end on this topic with this, and then we'll move on to our next subject. I was talking to Justin Whitlatch, our fine analyst, and he was saying, look for somebody who potentially has roots in the Pete Carroll tree, which, there's a name I'll throw out there, Chris Richard, who was formerly with the, or Richard, I don't know how he pronounces it, with the Cowboys, but he was a player under Carroll and a coach under Carroll, but, we don't know. We're going to hear a lot of the same names that get thrown out there before. LSU defensive back coach Corey Raymond, who seems to love to interview for jobs, or at least be mentioned, and then get raises at LSU. John Haycock. I'll throw a name out there. How about Lovie Smith, formerly of Illinois? That would be certainly an interesting situation. But again, what is his philosophy compared to what it is that Day wants, what it is that Combs wants? We don't know. So we'll work over the weekend to see if we can come up with a candidate list. We don't know how quickly this is going to come together. We do know that it's really not going to be until February 1 that we're going to start seeing the off-season program really starting to kick in. We did learn that over the weekend, all of the early enrollees should be getting on campus, and then they have to go through a week of quarantine. So look for things to start ramping up in February. We don't have any plans at this point of what spring practice is going to look like, what a timeline would be with no spring break. It certainly could change some things up. But those are all things that we'll talk about later over at Buckeye Grove. The next subject I want to get to is the NFL draft. And we're still a ways away from that in Cleveland, probably via some sort of virtual manner just based on the world we live in today. But we had the opportunity, with the deadline on the 18th in terms of underclassmen declaring. And while the seniors, if they want an extra year, they have until March 1st to make that decision publicly known. We have a pretty good idea of who's going to be back and who's not going to be back. And, let's kind of start with some of the seniors. And, I'm a positive guy. Let's start with the glass half full. Guys like Haskell Garrett, Thayer Munford, Antoine Jackson, Marcus Williamson, all guys that are going to be back for another season. Just, the impact of some of those types of decisions.
Yeah, I think it's a huge impact. Kind of like with this, the Madison situation, experience is hard to replace. And for a roster like Ohio State, you get Munford to return to that offensive line that's going to lose, Josh Myers and Wyatt Davis. It's going to be huge, especially for Paris Johnson, who, stepped up a little bit in the national championship game when Davis went down. And, Harry Miller obviously had a little bit of a learning curve, and so he might move over to center. And so Munford, really anchoring that offensive line is going to be great for whoever that next quarterback is. And as you mentioned, Haskell Garrett is going to do the same thing on the defensive line, especially with Togiai moving on to the NFL. Haskell really burst onto the scene, and they talked about it today. What a story. And, especially with, with him testing positive for COVID in the summer and then his incident at the end of August, really no lead up for him, and for Haskell to play the way he did this season was outstanding. So his return, obviously, both lines are going to have some great elder statesmen returning.
And then, of course, on the other side, I don't think we should have been really surprised by any of the seniors that opted to, call it an Ohio State career. Jonathan Cooper, Justin Hilliard, Baron Browning, both specialists with Blake Hobbiel, Drew Chrisman, Pete Werner. The expectation is that Tuff Borland will be in that mix. And then, of course, graduate transfer Trey Sermon also. And I think Ohio State fans were really hoping for an opportunity to see what a 12-game season with him would look like. We just lost Jacob, so we're going to try and bring him back in as I kind of filibuster here. It's an interesting situation with what it is that the Buckeyes are going to have to sit there and replace, but at least this gives us an idea of what things are going to look like in terms of a roster. Where it is that you kind of need to be, and we're calling Jacob back here really quick to see if we can get him latched back into the show. You with me, Jacob?
Yeah, I'm back on here.
All right, cool. Kind of went through the seniors. No real surprises there, right? That are leaving.
Yeah. In terms of the departing seniors, no big surprises. From my part, more of it came from the underclassmen. But I'm really happy to see guys like Jonathan Cooper, finally get to realize his chance at the next level, because with his talent that he showed this season and the leadership too, that's obviously a great, it could be a lottery ticket for an NFL team to take. And guys like Justin Hilliard too, who a similar situation to Cooper, just coming back after injury and then really turning it on to another level there at the latter half of the season. Those guys, those upperclassmen, they deserve a shot at the NFL, and I'm curious where they'll land.
Yeah, and especially for a guy like Justin Hilliard. I mean, what is he, like 30 now? I mean, he was at Ohio State, long enough for a couple of degrees. But let's shift over to the underclassmen, and we'll start with the guys that are coming back again. And I think that the biggest news was Chris Olave, and that's not taking anything away from Jeremy Ruckert or Tyreek Smith or Seven Banks or Nick Petit-Frere, but certainly the news that Chris Olave is coming back, I know I can only speak for myself. I know it caught me by surprise. Oftentimes, and I sit there and say on here that we do pre-write stories at times when we feel that we know what's going to happen with something, and we only had one version pre-written with Chris Olave, and that was with him leaving. And then lo and behold, he's coming back for another run. So that takes a position that Ohio State was already ridiculously deep at and makes it even deeper.
Yeah, 100%. I was definitely not expecting Olave to, return to Ohio State. I was kind of writing him off as like, what sort of round could he get chosen in the draft? And so I liked your comment once about like Ohio State. This is like Ohio State adding a 6-star essentially. And then our kind of collaborative story we had like last week, I noted that one of the biggest surprises for me this season was the lack of depth from the wide receivers that the Buckeyes have. And so Olave's return is going to test that again with the current freshmen and rising sophomores and Fleming and Jackson Smith, Njigba and whatnot. So I'm curious now, especially with, Emeka Egbuka, added in from the 2021 class, how else that's going to be affected with Olave's return. And it's obviously going to mean that Olave and Garrett Wilson are going to continue lighting up the sidelines, which I'll take that, every season that you could offer me, because Olave's impact to this Ohio State team means that the offense isn't going to be one-dimensional like we saw in his absence.
Right, and you never know really what the offense is going to look like, because you don't have Justin Fields as one of the underclassmen who is leaving, and you certainly had to account for his ability to run the ball and do some stuff. And the thing is, it's not like you're going to put in C.J. Stroud or Kyle McCord or Jack Miller into that position and say, okay, go be Justin Fields. So you're going to need to pick up that yardage, and it may not necessarily come in the same fashion. So you do sit there and you're just like, well, you want to have your best players out there at all times, and certainly Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave have proven to be those guys. But I also think that when you sit there and you look at Luke Farrell moving on or whatnot, that maybe they don't come out of the 12 as much, and they have 3 receivers out there more. And, there's certainly some opportunities to be able to get guys more than just maybe, Jamison Williams out there or whatnot. So, I mean, it's a good problem to have. And the truth of the matter is that we know that Chris Olave is done after this season. I think all bets would indicate that Garrett Wilson's probably done after this season. That opportunity is going to be there. I mean, even if you were to sit there and leave a program to go look for a clearer path, by the time you were able to get incorporated or whatnot, that clear path could be at Ohio State anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Brian Day had touched on it, earlier in the presser. Guys who stay at Ohio State have a chance to boost their stock and continue to prove that they are ready, because he said, when the NFL selects a player, they want them to come in ready to go and produce, almost from the get-go. And so if you're not prepared, it's obviously going to be a drawback, and these NFL teams aren't going to want to develop you, rather than, you were expected to come in from college level. So guys like Olave and Garrett Wilson, I hadn't really thought too much about both of them being in next year's draft class already. So perhaps that'll spur a little bit of like a teammate competition to see who can boost their stock ahead of the other, which would ultimately translate, on paper to, some success on the football field.
While we were surprised about Olave staying, I think I was probably equally surprised with defensive tackle Tommy Togiai leaving. And that has nothing to do with not thinking that Tommy didn't have enough tape out there and certainly wasn't ready for the NFL. But, for whatever reason, I guess I was just under the impression all along that he had one more year left in him. Maybe they lose Haskell Garrett, but that Tommy Togiai would be back. So, what were your views in terms of the Togiai decision?
Yeah, kind of along similar lines. Togiai, I think he's riding, how high his stock is right now. He was an obvious big time force on the defensive line, especially with Haskell right next to him, especially at that defensive tackle position. And so I think, obviously with his stock at a high, he's going to have a greater opportunity, to go higher in the draft. But, kind of how it was mentioned in some stories over at Buckeye Grove, he only played like one season as a true starter and contributed, 1.5 seasons. And with this season already being shortened, he doesn't have too much film, kind of as you mentioned, but his size is there. I look at him on the depth chart, and the few times I've seen him in person at games, he stands out on the sidelines. He is absolutely incredible in terms of stature. So whichever team gets him, they're going to already have a guy with a size advantage and, almost a natural instinct to contribute along, inside that defensive line.
And just to kind of round out some of the other decisions, you already talked about Myers and Davis both leaving off the offensive line. And then, of course, there's Shaun Wade, the cornerback who, next week or the week after, I plan on having an NFL draft expert on. We'll talk a little bit about what this season may have meant to Shaun Wade as he made the move from slot corner to outside corner. But, one thing that can't be denied is it takes a position that Ohio State was already critically thin at, and they're even more thin now because, they should get Cameron Brown back at some point. But, you're losing somebody with a lot of starting experience in Shaun Wade. And, I think it's got to be an all-hands-on-decks type of situation when you look at the corner position going into 21.
Yeah, I agree 100%. When we talked with Shaun Wade in the weeks leading up to the national championship and whatnot, I was kind of hoping he would lead people on to think that Sevyn Banks may be the protege in training in a sense, because truly, the secondary, although it brings a season worth of experience, it was a shortened season at that. And so if Kerry Coombs continues to work with that secondary, there's going to be a bit of a learning curve again next season, I would anticipate. And they're just as raw in a sense from their production that they had down the stretch. And so Shaun Wade's departure obviously is great for him because he's got the talent. He's proven it before. And so just taking a look at some of the prospective stories about his NFL talent, whether he's going to go move back to slot corner or even step in some safety looks, he's going to translate, especially if he rides that confidence that he has when he plays. He's got the talent, and so I'm curious to see how he's going to translate to the professional level.
Well, the good news is we have plenty of time to talk about the upcoming NFL draft. We will not have a scouting combine in terms of traditional scouting combines. We should get some information, hopefully, in the coming weeks about what an Ohio State Pro Day may look like and how that all works. But we have a lot of time to talk about all of that. And then, of course, even beyond that, just the players that are coming back and who's going to step into those roles. So plenty of reason to keep with us over at BuckeyeGrove.com and keep listening to us here on the BIA podcast. We've got a lot more coming up after this very short break. Egg Water Conditioning has been treating well in city water in Central Ohio with American-made water filtration products for over 60 years. Have a water quality problem? The water treatment experts at Hague know how to solve it. Not sure if your water softener is working? They will test, inspect, and sanitize any brand of water softener for only $20. Schedule a system checkup or water test today by calling 614-836-2195 or visit them online at HagueH2O.com. That's HAGUE H2O.com. Welcome back to the BIA podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Noon. I am joined by Jacob Benge, and we are talking here on a Friday. In this first segment, we talked about the Greg Mattison news as well as NFL departures and returnees to Ohio State. Let's kind of move around a little bit here in this second segment, and a lot of discussion right now, and I mean that by fans, not necessarily by the College Football Playoff Committee, about playoff expansion. Year in and year out, it seems that it's pretty much the same 4 to 6 teams, more or less, that are in the field, and that doesn't seem to be separating anytime soon. Those are also the same 4 to 6 teams that are in the same 4 to 6 top positions of the Rivals recruiting rankings. There's just not a lot of shakeup there. Now, there's talk about a 6-team field, an 8-team field. I mean, just whatnot. I mean, a lot of stuff going on there. I know I have my opinions on here. I was never really a strong playoff proponent to begin with. I'm a fan of the bowl system, and I think some of the imperfections of that are endearing, but a little messy in terms of picking a national champion. I know that I certainly don't like the 4-team playoff the way that it is, but I don't know if I don't like a playoff to begin with, if I can just jump in and push all my chips on an 8-team playoff. What say you?
It's a great debate, and personally, I think it's inevitable that the playoff gets expanded. And, I take a lot of enjoyment in hearing everybody's arguments about, the playoff should be this way and the playoff should be that way. But you mentioned it a second ago. I think these bowl games need to matter a lot more. I know the Selection Sunday takes part almost before or around the same time these bowl games are scheduled out and hashed out who's going to be facing who and whatnot. And that's something that's piqued my interest is, what if the college football playoff selected its teams after these bowl games? It would make them matter more. You wouldn't have these, the top talent on these teams opting out to prepare for the NFL and whatnot. So, just long story short, I think playoff expansion is inevitable. Now, let's not get too crazy and start throwing in 16, 25 teams or whatnot, like a March Madness, but it's inevitable in my opinion.
I mean, I'll question this. We talk about, all right, if we go to 8, you have the 5 Power 5 conferences, maybe a spot for a group of 5 champion, like the best, the top rated, whatever team of the group of 5, and then a couple of wild cards. A couple of questions I have from here. One, not all the conferences are built the same. They're not all equal in terms of level of competition, certainly in the number of conference games that you play, whether or not you play FCS teams or you don't play FCS teams. Are you going to be able to sit there and just give an automatic berth to each conference if they don't all get on the same page? And 2, how do you sit there and stop a situation short of just saying in the bylaws that this can't happen, to where you end up having your 5 champions, your G5 champion, and then just 2 more teams out of the SEC? And obviously the SEC has proven in most years it is the top conference in terms of depth and whatnot, but I don't think we're going to see people that much happier that are outside of the SEC footprint if 3 SEC teams are making up this 8-team field, and then a 4th team is a G5 team that, whether or not, a lot of people probably won't feel deserve to be in the field, and you're still looking at the Big Ten and some of these other conferences only getting 1 team in the dance.
Yeah, and we saw kind of this season with Cincinnati and BYU and Coastal, all these teams getting almost shorted in, the ranking systems that the CFP puts out every week. And so I would be intrigued to see a group of 5 team make the playoff and compete with these bigger Power 5 schools. In terms of 3 SEC teams making an 8-team playoff field, it almost seems like that would happen more often than not, just because of that depth that you mentioned. And with Clemson, Clemson's kind of, ran the table with the ACC, obviously, the past couple of years with Deshaun Watson and now Trevor Lawrence. But I'm curious what direction the Tigers go, with Lawrence obviously leaving, and, North Carolina has really stepped up a notch this season. But, having multiple SEC teams in there and then the chance for a group of 5 team to get in there obviously is going to expand the fan base for a potential larger college football playoff um, seedings and whatnot. But in terms of like the other conferences, like the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, how are those going to round out? And automatic berths too are something to consider, because you give it to the conference winner with the best records, you give it to the winner of the conference championship game. There's just a couple of things to hash out. And, just as I mentioned a minute ago, there are as many arguments for that as there are, situations that could play out.
Yeah, because there certainly is no incentive to be over and above everybody else in terms of the number of conference games played or whatnot. I mean, you want to put yourself not only in position to protect your champion, but to try and get a second team. So, I don't know. I think that there really needs to be some uniformity there in order to try and get everybody on the same page, because this unequal footing certainly is not, is not fair. And I know life's not fair, big deal. I get it. But, when everybody's clamoring to move to 8, it's not because, we want to see more teams involved or whatever. I think it's just because they're like, well, this isn't fair the way that it stands now. Well, you can just expand it and it's still not going to be fair.
I'm curious, if they do expand it, because you mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, it's usually the same 4 to 6, somewhere around there, teams that make it. And so how does it impact recruiting, in your opinion? Do you see the same, the recruits going to the same programs, and then that tradition continues with the same 4 to 6 teams making the playoff? Whereas if the playoff did expand, recruits would maybe consider going to a group of 5 team, or, a middle to upper tier Power 5 team. Do you see those recruits kind of, spreading more out to those programs, or would it not be the case so much?
I don't think going to 8 is suddenly going to help Iowa or, I don't know, Texas A&M, or, I don't think it's going to help some of these teams that just, are not getting in the 4-team world. I don't think that suddenly people are going to be like, well, now I've got a greater possibility of getting into that championship. You still have to slay the dragon that are those top 4 to 6 teams. And, those top 4 to 6 teams are top 4 to 6 teams for a reason, whether it be, coaching or facilities or this or that or the other. I mean, I don't think that you can just wave a wand and say, okay, now that we're an 8-team playoff, suddenly we're going to see more parity. This is just, college football is not a salary cap. And of course, people, in light of all the Tennessee news and bags of McDonald's cash or whatever, are going to talk about a salary cap, but it's not a salary cap type situation. There's not a star rating cap of where you're only allowed to sign, if you got kids between 2 and 5 stars or whatever. You can't sit there and say, okay, you have to split this amongst 80 stars or whatever to try and split things up. So I don't know if it necessarily helps anything. And honestly, let's say we do go to 8. Yes, in the first year of the college football playoff, we saw the number 4 seed, Ohio State, win the whole darn thing. But do we really see a situation of where 5, 6, 7, and 8 are going to have a lot of success? Especially if it is a situation of where we think it is kind of a top 4 and everybody else. I mean, there are going to be upsets. I mean, certainly. I mean, we see, 15-2 upsets in March Madness or whatever. But I think when you get into such a small little phone booth like the college football playoff, and, under worst case scenarios, you're playing the 3 games, you're not going to be looking past anybody. I don't think that there's the opportunity for that to happen. Whereas, maybe in college basketball or whatever, you're looking at the name on the front of the jersey or whatever, and it's like, really, is Santa Clara really going to do this? And then they do it. I mean, so I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. I don't like 4. I really don't like the idea of 8. I certainly don't like the idea of 6. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I will say, just thank goodness there is no cap for the stars limit, because, that just would be a mess. That's a whole subjective, type of system anyway. But, I guess you mentioned it a minute ago, if there is an expanded field and we see more Power 5 teams make it and whatnot, would that de-incentivize programs to start scheduling more Power 5 non-conference matchups like Ohio State and Oklahoma and whatnot? And incentivize Ohio State scheduling teams like Cincinnati or UCF or Florida Atlantic, because those group of 5 teams in an expanded field would have, quote unquote, more of a chance to make it. And, an expanded system. And you'd see Ohio State match up with Coastal just because they have, like I said, a quote unquote greater chance. Thus, declining the Oklahoma-Ohio State matchups and the stronger Power 5 matchups.
I think it has the opposite effect. If you're in the Big Ten and you're more than likely only going to get one bid, let's just say, why would you schedule anything that could saddle you with a loss? And we joke about, oh, well, a good loss is better than a good win. Well, only if you're in the SEC, apparently. So why would you sit there and put yourself in a situation to where you're already hurting your resume and your potential seeding? Because now seeding is going to matter even more. Why would you put yourself in that type of situation? Because all we're saying is that the group or all 5 Power 5 conference teams would make the field. That doesn't. What happens if it's an SEC champion and 2 SEC wildcards make it and they rank them 1, 3, and 4? And if we're doing the first round of the playoffs on campus, so I don't know if there's any incentive there for that, and I certainly don't know if there's any incentive for Power 5 teams to schedule difficult Group of 5 teams that could just knock them out of the situation. I don't know, because there's not enough of a component out there. There's certainly not enough of a known component based on what strength of schedule truly gets you. We don't know. And you sit there and you can look at the ACC, and the ACC has been 2.5 teams most years or whatever, pre-Notre Dame. It's been Clemson, and then, maybe you're getting a 3/4 credit for either UNC or somebody like that, and about a half credit for somebody else. I don't know why you would go out of your way to schedule more difficult when, yeah, there certainly is a plus if you win, but it's fatal if you lose.
And that does make sense. I do like seeing these non-conference matchups that were sorely missed this season. And so, these group of 5 teams are going to continue their argument of, what about our share at the college football playoff? Because if it's truly a national championship, why not us? And so it's hard to, make that case for their participation in the CFP, especially when teams like Coastal or Cincinnati, have these near undefeated perfect records, and you get 2 lost teams that are almost, grabbing that 4 seed and whatnot. And so it just, makes that argument much more, difficult to watch, especially on Twitter or on these social media platforms and whatnot. I don't think I've seen many head coaches or teams come out and just start flat out tearing up the CFP system. I think they're thinking it. And so that's why I'm curious if they're going to try and, start scheduling games to make their cases greater than what it is now.
We honestly probably should have just done a whole show on playoff expansion. We've gone a lot further there. So I'm going to throw one last topic out, and then we will call it a day. And that is the news, obviously, of Urban Meyer coming out of retirement to take over the Jacksonville Jaguars head coaching job. He comes in and he only really takes one person from Ohio State, Ryan Stamper. We're not going to talk about Anthony Schlegel, who really wasn't serving a position with Ohio State. He was on local radio here. He's assembling his staff. He certainly has, a very unique type of situation based on salary cap space, draft picks, the position of those draft picks. Do you think that Urban Meyer will be successful making the move from the college game to the pro game, a move that not a lot of coaches have been able to come out and conquer?
Oh, man, it's a great question because, like we said on the live a week ago, I associate Urban with winning. And so if I see him losing more than a handful of games or even a couple at that, it's something that it's tough to see. But, he's in that weird AFC South division where the Texans are in a state of flux with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. Philip Rivers is retiring from Indianapolis. The Titans can go to the conference title game one year and get bounced in the first round the next. And so Jacksonville, like you mentioned, has a lot of those draft picks that are really high and then they have an enormous amount of salary cap to, even make more wild cards join their roster. And so I think Urban's way of coaching is unique enough to where if he can get those players who have, played at the game's highest level for longer than a college, obviously, to buy into that mantra, then perhaps the Jaguars are going to have a bit of a resurgence rather than, these 10-loss seasons that they've had, the last 2 or 3 seasons since making the AFC title game.
As I'd mentioned earlier, we got plenty of time to talk about the draft, so we're not going to play the game of Trevor versus Justin versus whoever with that number 1 pick. But what do you think, and I'm going to end on this, what do you think a realistic record for the Jags will be in this 21-22 season? And I know this is so early. We don't know who they're drafting. We don't know what they're going to be able to go out and get in terms of free agency. I mean, we're just basing this all off of hype and everything else. But, a team that just loses 10 games on the reg, is Urban going to be able to snap that? Is Urban going to be able to get them to 500? I mean, without knowing any data point whatsoever, I want you to sit there and make a prediction.
Yeah, it's another fun guesstimation. I had the schedule breakdown in part 5 of that Urban to Jacksonville series today. And I'll go out here and say 500 is a possibility. Urban Meyer mentioned it in his introductory press conference that the NFL is a league built for teams to go 500. And so just looking at, where he is and what the Jaguars' schedule is next season, they realistically could go 8-8 next season. They play the Broncos, they play the Jets, they'll play the 49ers, who really, it's a shocking team in itself for another topic. And then the AFC South, I consider it to be a little bit weaker than a different or other NFL divisions. And so, who Urban, he's hinted at taking a quarterback number 1, who Urban, develops and gets that roster to round out, they realistically do have a shot to go 8-8. And I think that's the benchmark for Urban's first season. Is it attainable? Well, it'll be surprising if he does, because that would be a hell of a jump from 1-15 to 8-8. But that's what I'll go ahead and go on the record and say. Urban Meyer will go 500 in his first season.
I'll be interested to see that. As a Cowboys fan, I'm really a man without a nation right now because they're horrible. So I don't know if I'm going to go out and buy any Jags gear, but I'm going to be interested to see. I had a couple other topics that I had in mind, but I'm going to save those for another show. I'll just have you come back on next week if we can make that work and see what we got from there. But any final thoughts before I send us on our way?
I'm eager to get back on the show. Talking football is good stuff, especially with the start of the off season now. Basketball is obviously in season. Marcus did a great job on the show earlier this week. So, just keep following up on Ohio State athletics, because each week seemingly presents a new storyline, and I'm just glad I'm here to cover it here at Buckeye Grove.
And we're glad to have you. So, we will call it a show on that. I want to thank Jacob Benge for being part of the show, and I want to thank you all for listening to the BIA podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon, and we will talk to you again here very soon.
Be sure to stay up to date with Buckeye Grove Instant Access when the news breaks or after the big game, exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher as part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcasts Network. Hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know and never miss a single episode.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing, and come visit us over at BuckeyeGrove.com for all the best Ohio State information on the web.